Have you ever noticed something strange? You can understand an English movie. You can understand YouTube videos. You can even understand this conversation right now. But the moment someone looks at you and asks a simple question, "So, tell me about yourself," everything disappears. Your mind becomes completely quiet, not because you don't know English, but because your English suddenly feels trapped somewhere between your brain and your mouth. I've watched this happen thousands of times. I've seen engineers with brilliant ideas, doctors who could read medical journals in English, university students who passed advanced English exams, managers who wrote excellent emails, and yet, when it came time to actually speak, they smiled nervously, they apologized, then they said the sentence I've probably heard more than any other in my teaching career: "I understand English, but I can't speak it." Whenever someone says that to me, I never think, this person needs more grammar. I never think, they need another vocabulary list. Instead, I quietly ask myself one question: when was the last time this person actually let their mouth practice speaking English? Because understanding a language and producing a language are two very different skills, and that's something most learners never hear. Imagine buying a beautiful guitar. You watch hundreds of tutorials. You memorize every chord. You know the names of every string. You understand music theory, but you never touch the instrument. One day, someone hands you the guitar and says, "Play." Would you expect beautiful music? Of course not. Not because you're unintelligent, because your hands have never learned what your brain already knows. Speaking English works exactly the same way. Your brain may already know thousands of words, but your mouth hasn't built the habit of finding them quickly. And habits, that's what I want to talk about today. Not talent, not intelligence, not age, not grammar. Habits. Because after teaching English for many years, I've become convinced of something that surprises almost every new student. Fluent speakers usually don't know dramatically more English than intermediate learners. They simply use the English they already know much more often. That changes everything. I remember meeting a woman named Elena. She was from Spain. She worked in international marketing. When she first joined one of my speaking programs, she warned me before class even started. She laughed awkwardly and said, "Please don't ask me difficult questions." I smiled. Then I asked, "What did you eat for breakfast?" She froze. Not because breakfast was difficult, because speaking itself felt dangerous. After class, she apologized. She thought she had disappointed me, but honestly, I was excited because I knew exactly where the real problem was. It wasn't English. It was fear mixed with silence. And silence is incredibly powerful. The longer we stay silent, the more natural silence becomes. Then one day we begin believing a story about ourselves. I'm shy. I'm bad at languages. My memory isn't good. I'll start speaking when I'm ready. I've heard every version. But here's something I want you to think about. What if you're not waiting because you're not ready? What if you're not ready because you've been waiting? There's a huge difference. Years ago, I noticed something interesting while watching children learn language. Parents almost never celebrate perfect grammar. A little child says, "Doggy run," and everyone smiles. Nobody says, "Actually, that's grammatically incomplete." They celebrate communication. Adults do the opposite. Adults stay silent until every word feels perfect, and perfection never arrives. So silence wins again. That realization completely changed how I teach. Today, when a new learner joins my class, I don't ask, "How much English do you know?" I ask, "How often do you let yourself speak?" Those two questions measure completely different things. And this is where everything starts. Not with another textbook, not with another grammar course, but with permission. permission to sound imperfect, permission to hesitate, permission to search for words, permission to laugh, permission to continue anyway. Because every fluent speaker you've ever admired has spoken thousands of imperfect sentences. You just never heard those. You only heard the result. And that's a dangerous illusion. Let me tell you about someone else. His name was Amir. He worked as a software developer, brilliant programmer, quiet personality. He rarely spoke during our online sessions. One evening I asked him privately, "Why don't you join the conversations?" He answered honestly, "I don't want people to hear my mistakes." I asked him another question. "How many mistakes do you think everyone else notices?" He thought for a moment. Then he said, "Probably all of them." I smiled because I used to believe the same thing. Then I told him something psychologists have studied for years. Most people are far too busy worrying about themselves to carefully analyze every mistake you make. During conversations, people aren't grading your grammar. They're wondering what they'll say next. They're thinking about work, their family, dinner, their phone buzzing in their pocket, their own pronunciation. In other words, they're not watching you nearly as much as you imagine. The relief on his face was unforgettable. It was like someone had quietly unlocked a door he'd been pushing against for years. But here's what surprised me even more. Knowing that truth wasn't enough. Because understanding confidence isn't the same as practicing confidence. Again, the brain understood. The mouth still needed training. So I gave him one tiny assignment. Not an hour, not 30 minutes, just 5, every evening. For 5 minutes, he had to walk around his apartment, speaking English out loud. No audience, no camera, no teacher, no correction, just his own voice filling the room. The first week felt ridiculous. He admitted that. He laughed while telling me. He said, "I felt like I was pretending." I told him, "Good. Because every new habit feels like pretending before it feels natural." Think about riding a bicycle. The first time, balancing feels fake. Driving a car, typing on a keyboard, swimming, cooking, everything begins awkwardly. Language isn't different. We simply expect it to be. That's why so many adults quit too early. They're surprised by discomfort. But discomfort isn't evidence that you're failing. Sometimes, it's evidence that you're finally practicing the right skill. Around the second week, Amir noticed something unexpected. He wasn't speaking faster. He wasn't using bigger vocabulary, but he stopped translating every sentence. That tiny change created enormous freedom. Instead of thinking, "How do I say this?" he started thinking, "What can I say with the English I already have?" Do you hear the difference? One question searches for perfection. The other searches for communication. Communication always wins. There's another mistake almost everyone makes. They believe fluency comes from learning more words. Now, don't misunderstand me. Vocabulary matters. Of course it does. But vocabulary without automatic use is like owning thousands of books you've never opened. Knowledge isn't the same as access. Let me show you what I mean. Imagine I ask you, describe your bedroom. Most learners immediately begin searching for advanced vocabulary: comfortable, spacious, minimalist, organized, atmosphere, decoration. But fluent speakers often do something much simpler. They begin speaking immediately. My room isn't very big. I have a desk near the window. I usually study there. I keep too many books. I really need to clean it. Simple, natural, continuous. Fluency isn't built by impressive words. It's built by uninterrupted thought. That's why I tell my students something that surprises them. If you only know 1,000 English words, you can already have thousands of conversations. Because conversations aren't created by vocabulary alone. They're created by connection. And once you understand that, learning English starts feeling completely different. It stops becoming a school subject. It becomes a way of thinking, a way of noticing, a way of expressing your everyday life. Not your perfect life, your real one. And that's exactly where your transformation begins. One afternoon, after class, a student stayed behind while everyone else left the meeting. Her name was Mina. She was in her early 40s, worked as a nurse, and had spent nearly 20 years learning English on and off. She looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally. She smiled politely before saying something I'll never forget. "I think I'm too old to become fluent." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked her a different question. "When was the last time you learned something completely new?" She thought for a few seconds. Then she smiled. "I learned how to use online medical software during the pandemic." "Were you good at it on the first day?" She laughed. "Not even close." "What happened?" "I kept using it." Exactly. That's how adults learn. Not because their brains are different, because repetition quietly changes what feels unfamiliar. Language works the same way. But adults often expect confidence before repetition. Children don't. Children repeat until confidence appears. Adults wait for confidence before they repeat. That's why progress feels so slow. This is where everything changes. Your goal for the next 30 days isn't to sound fluent. It's to become someone who speaks every day. That identity matters much more than any single lesson. Because habits don't ask how motivated you feel. They simply ask, "What do you normally do?" I've worked with learners from more than 40 countries. Different accents, different cultures, different personalities. But eventually, I noticed something fascinating. The students who improved the fastest weren't necessarily the smartest. They weren't the youngest. They didn't always have the best pronunciation. They simply stopped treating English like homework. Instead, they started inviting English into ordinary moments. One student described what she saw while washing dishes. Another explained recipes while cooking dinner. One businessman talked to himself while driving home. A retired teacher described birds outside her kitchen window every morning. None of those activities looked impressive. Nobody would record them and upload them online. But those quiet moments changed their speaking forever. Because fluency grows in ordinary life, not only inside classrooms. Let me tell you about Carlos. Carlos loved learning English. Actually, he loved preparing to learn English. Every weekend, he downloaded new apps. He bought notebooks. He highlighted vocabulary. He organized folders. He watched videos about how to become fluent. But 6 months later, he still wasn't speaking. One day I asked him, "How much time did you spend actually speaking English this week?" He opened his calendar. Then he laughed. "Maybe 7 minutes. 7 minutes." He had spent over 10 hours preparing. 7 minutes practicing. I think many learners quietly fall into the same trap. Preparation feels productive. Practice feels uncomfortable. So we naturally choose preparation. It feels safer. But here's something I've learned after years of teaching. Your comfort zone is an excellent place to rest. It is a terrible place to build fluency. That doesn't mean you should overwhelm yourself. Actually, I recommend the opposite. I love tiny goals. Ridiculously tiny goals. For example, tomorrow morning, before you check your phone, describe the weather in English. That's it. 1 minute. Then the next day, describe your breakfast. The day after that, talk about the first person you met. Small conversations, small victories, small confidence. Those tiny moments accumulate much faster than dramatic study sessions you only do once a month. There was another student named Hannah. She believed she needed to think faster. "I know the answer," she told me. "But my brain is too slow." So we did a little experiment. I asked her 10 very simple questions. "What's your favorite season? Coffee or tea? Morning or night? What color is your backpack? What's something that made you smile this week? I timed every answer. Then I asked her something surprising. Did you notice what happened? She looked confused. I answered faster than usual. Exactly. Because she wasn't trying to sound intelligent. She was simply trying to communicate. Sometimes the pressure to sound fluent is exactly what prevents fluency. When you remove that pressure, your brain suddenly has room to breathe. That's why I encourage learners to stop chasing beautiful English. Instead, chase honest English. If you're tired, say you're tired. If you're excited, say you're excited. If you don't know a word, describe it. Native speakers do that all the time. Have you ever forgotten someone's name? Of course. Did the conversation end? No. You found another way. Language is wonderfully flexible. We often imagine conversations as tests. They're not. They're collaborations. The other person is trying to understand you just as much as you're trying to express yourself. That realization alone reduces so much anxiety. Here's another exercise I absolutely love. I call it the one-object conversation. Pick any object near you. Your phone, a cup, your shoes, a chair. Now speak about it for 2 minutes. Not perfectly, curiously. Where did you get it? How often do you use it? What memories does it bring? Would you recommend it to a friend? Would you buy it again? Suddenly, one simple object creates dozens of speaking opportunities. This teaches something incredibly valuable. The problem usually isn't that you have nothing to say. The problem is that your brain isn't yet used to exploring ideas in English. That ability grows surprisingly fast. But here's what surprised me most after watching thousands of learners. The breakthrough almost never feels dramatic. Nobody wakes up saying, I became fluent overnight. Instead, one ordinary Tuesday, someone realizes they answered a question without translating. Someone laughs at an English joke immediately. Someone orders coffee without rehearsing. Someone joins a meeting and speaks before overthinking. Tiny moments, quiet victories. Those are the moments that truly matter. Because fluency isn't one giant leap. It's hundreds of invisible improvements that suddenly become visible. Around the middle of your 30-day journey, you'll probably experience something frustrating. Your progress may seem to slow down. You'll wonder, why am I still making mistakes? Good. That's actually a healthy sign. When beginners improve, they notice obvious changes. Later, the improvements become smaller, more subtle, better rhythm, shorter pauses, clearer pronunciation, faster recall. Those changes are harder to notice, but they're incredibly important. Think about learning to drive. At first, you're focused on finding the pedals. Later, you hardly think about them. Your attention moves somewhere else. Speaking develops exactly the same way. At first, you search for words. Later, you start thinking about ideas instead. That's real progress. Not because your English became perfect, because your attention finally became free. And that's something no vocabulary list can teach you. It only comes from using the language again and again. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to ask you one final question. Not to test your English, not to measure your grammar, just one honest question. What would your life look like if speaking English no longer scared you? Take a moment. Really imagine it. Maybe you'd finally apply for that international job you've been thinking about. Maybe you'd travel without rehearsing every sentence in your head. Maybe you'd join conversations instead of quietly listening. Maybe you'd make friends from different countries. Maybe you'd stop saying, sorry, my English isn't very good. Not because your English suddenly became perfect, but because you no longer believed it had to be. I've watched that transformation happen so many times that I almost expect it now. But I never stop appreciating it, because it isn't just about language, it's about freedom. Freedom to express who you already are. One student reminded me of this in the most unexpected way. His name was Kenji. He worked as an architect, very thoughtful, very quiet. For nearly 2 months, he barely spoke during our live sessions. Then one evening, something changed. We were discussing our favorite places in our hometowns. Nothing complicated, just simple conversation. Suddenly, Kenji began talking. Not quickly, not perfectly, but naturally. He described a small bridge where he used to walk with his grandfather. He explained how the river looked at sunset. He smiled while speaking. He even forgot to worry about grammar. When he finished, the class was completely silent. Not because anyone noticed his mistakes, because everyone had been listening to his story. After class, he sent me a message. I didn't realize I had spoken for almost 4 minutes. That sentence made me smile. Do you know why? Because he wasn't counting grammar anymore. He wasn't counting vocabulary anymore. He was communicating. That's the moment every learner eventually reaches. And interestingly, it rarely arrives when you're trying to impress people. It arrives when you're simply trying to share something meaningful. That's why I always encourage my students to talk about real life. Talk about your childhood, your favorite food, a difficult day at work, a movie you enjoyed, a place you hope to visit someday. Talk about your dog, your grandmother, your morning coffee, your dreams. Because language grows much faster when it's connected to something you genuinely care about. Words attached to emotion stay with us longer. Psychologists have known this for years. Our brains remember meaningful experiences far better than isolated information. That's one reason memorizing random vocabulary lists feels so difficult. There's no emotional connection. But tell me about the meal you cooked last night. And suddenly, the vocabulary belongs somewhere. It has a home. That changes everything. Now let me share the 30-day journey I'd love for you to try. Not because it's magical, not because 30 days will make you sound exactly like a native speaker, but because 30 days is long enough to build a habit. And habits quietly shape identity. Days 110. Wake up your voice. Every morning, before checking social media, speak English for 10 minutes. Not in your head, out loud. Describe your room. Describe your plans. Describe yesterday. Describe today. If you run out of ideas, look around. There's always something to talk about. A lamp, a window, the weather, your schedule. The important thing isn't complexity. It's consistency. Every evening, record yourself for 2 or 3 minutes. Don't perform. Don't try to sound impressive. Simply speak. Then listen, not to criticize yourself, to understand yourself. Ask simple questions. Where did I hesitate? Which words did I repeat? Which sentence felt easy? Which sentence felt difficult? That awareness becomes your teacher. Days 11-20. Borrow the rhythm. During these 10 days, begin shadowing. Choose a short video from a speaker whose voice feels calm and natural. Listen to one sentence. Pause. Repeat. Copy not only the words, but the rhythm, the pauses, the energy. Notice how native speakers connect words together. Notice how relaxed they sound. You're not trying to become someone else. You're training your mouth to become more flexible. Think about musicians. Before creating their own style, they often learn by playing someone else's music. Language works the same way. Shadowing isn't copying forever. It's borrowing rhythm until your own voice becomes more comfortable. Keep recording yourself each evening. Compare your recordings from day 1 and day 20. The difference may surprise you, not because you'll suddenly sound perfect, because you'll sound more relaxed. Relaxation is often the first sign of progress. Days 21-30. Build real conversations. Now it's time to leave your comfort zone. Find another learner, a tutor, a language exchange partner. a friend. Even one conversation each day can change everything. Don't prepare long speeches. Real conversations aren't prepared. Ask simple questions. Answer honestly. Listen carefully. If you forget a word, don't panic. Describe it. Gesture if you need to. Laugh. Keep talking. Communication is wonderfully forgiving. Something beautiful happens during these final 10 days. Your brain begins trusting your mouth. Instead of translating every sentence, ideas begin arriving directly in English. Not every sentence, not every conversation, but more often than before. And that's the beginning of fluency, not perfection, trust. I want to leave you with 3 ideas that I hope you'll remember long after this lesson ends. The first is this: your mouth learns through use, not observation. Watching English videos helps. Reading helps. Listening helps. But none of those activities can replace speaking. At some point, your voice has to join the learning process. The second idea is this: confidence follows action. Almost nobody becomes confident first. We speak. We survive. We speak again. Then confidence quietly appears. Waiting to feel confident before speaking is like waiting to become strong before going to the gym. It happens in the opposite order. And finally, the third idea: your goal is not to sound like someone else. I know many wonderful English speakers: American, Canadian, Indian, Nigerian, Singaporean, Australian, British, Irish, Filipino. Every one of them sounds different. English belongs to the world now. It doesn't belong to one accent. It belongs to everyone who uses it to connect with another human being, including you. So please, don't measure your progress by asking, "Do I sound like a native speaker?" Instead ask, "Can I express my thoughts a little more easily than yesterday?" That's a much healthier question, and it's the one that leads to long-term success. One day you'll notice something wonderful. Someone will ask you a question in English. You'll answer immediately. Then, a few minutes later, you'll suddenly realize something. I didn't translate. That moment may last only a second, but you'll never forget it. Because you'll realize your brain has quietly been changing all along. Not through pressure, not through perfection, but through daily practice. One sentence, then another. One conversation, then another. One ordinary day after another. Until one day, speaking English simply becomes something you do. If you're listening to my voice today, I hope you make yourself one small promise: not to study for 5 hours tomorrow, not to memorize 100 new words, just one promise: that you'll speak English out loud today, even if it's only for 1 minute, because one honest minute today is worth more than another month of waiting for the perfect moment. And if today's lesson helped you see English a little differently, I'd love to keep learning with you. There are many more conversations waiting for us here on Motion English. So, when you're ready, take a deep breath, say your first sentence, then click on the next lesson. I'll be waiting for you there.